Hello everyone. In this video, we're gonna talk about the first part of the brainstem, which is the medulla oblongata. But before we talk about it, I just want to apologize for a mistake that I said in the ascending tracts summary that I had in my previous video, which is I wrote here that the dorsal columns stop at the nucleus proprius, and they actually don't. They stop at the nucleus gracilis and cuneatus, and this is what I already discussed in that slide itself. Just the summary has a problem, and this is the correction. I don't want to talk about the nucleus proprius as it's not mentioned in all the books. Some of the books they would say that spinothalamic tracts, the lateral and the anterior, one of them stops at the substantia gelatinosa, and some of them they would say nucleus proprius. Most of the books they would say that it stops at the substantia gelatinosa. Anyway, so you can just forget about the nucleus proprius. The dorsal columns do not stop at the nucleus proprius. They ascend without crossing, and they will stop at the level of the nucleus gracilis and cuneatus, and this is what we're going to talk about in this video. Okay, so this is just a correction, and let's proceed. Now, before we talk about the brainstem, I just want you to understand the broad idea of the brainstem. Now we have here the brain up, and we have the spinal cord, and then we have sensations that we talked about them coming through the spinal cord. So they need to go through the brainstem so that they can reach the brain. And I have also descending motor tracts that they need to go all the way through the brainstem so that they can reach the spinal cord and supply the limbs and muscles and whatever. Now, so what is the idea of the brainstem? Why do we have a brainstem? The brainstem is actually a place where we have ascending and descending tracts, and then when they come to the brainstem, we're gonna call them lemnisci. Remember when I told you previously, lemnisci are nothing but the tracts, but because they are condensed in a small places, we call them lemnisci. Okay, so this is number one. Number two, you guys remember we have head and neck, right? And we have sensations in our face, and we have different types of sensations, and we have motor functions. And if we talked about the spinal cord as it's the place to receive the sensations from the body, and it's the place where we have the cell bodies of the motor neurons that reach the body, now when I talk about my head, I need a place, and that is gonna be my brainstem. Okay, so when you want to study the brainstem, remember that number one, you have stuff coming from down that you've already studied in the spinal cord, and stuff going down, coming from down to up, and motor stuff coming from up to down, and this is all related to the spinal cord. And here we're gonna call them lemnisci, and they're gonna be at the tegmentum. All right, number two, we have the cranial nerve nuclei because the cranial nerves they all need to take care of the head and neck structures. Okay, so I need to have the nuclei, I need to have the group of cell bodies of these nerves that needs to supply everything in my head and neck. Number three, I have connections with the cerebellum. And these connections are my cerebellar peduncle. If I have a connection with the cerebellum, with the topmost structure of the brainstem, which is the midbrain, it's going to be the superior cerebellar peduncle. If the connection is with the pons, it's going to be the middle cerebellar peduncle. If it's the connection with the medulla, it's going to be the inferior cerebellar peduncle. And in the cerebellum video, we're going to talk about all the peduncles. We're going to talk about the inputs and outputs that they go through the peduncle, superior, middle, and inferior. We're going to touch on some of them in this video because they are related to the brainstem or the medulla. However, they're going to be explained into more interesting details when we reach the cerebellum. All right? So when we want to study the brainstem, I want you to remember, number one, the tracks going up and down, these gonna be the lemnisci, and they're gonna be located at the tegmentum. Remember, you guys, when we took the introduction, we said that we have a terminology called tegmentum, and tegmentum means the core of your brainstem. If that is your core, then you have to think about the lemnisci, okay? So you have to think about the tracks. They were coming from down, going up, all right? So they're gonna be here. Number two, you need to think about the cranial nerve nuclei. So again, tegmentum, lemnisci, cranial nerve nuclei. Again, tegmentum, lemnisci, cranial nerve nuclei. Which cranial nerves? Perfect. Which cranial nerves? If we are at the midbrain, remember 3 and 4. Remember the cranial nerves, the order of the cranial nerves. You have number 1 and 2 arising from the cortex, 3 and 4 arising from the midbrain. 5, 6, 7, and 8 arising from the pons, 9, 10, 11, 12 related to the medulla. However, there are some extra stuff between the pons and medulla, and we're going to talk about that as we proceed. And remember that there is a silly nerve. His name is the trigeminal, and the trigeminal has more than the nuclei that are related to the pons. So you will find extra nuclei related to the trigeminal, and you will find them in the midbrain and the medulla. So this is a very silly nerve. Another nerve which is also silly is the vestibular, and that will have nuclei in pons and medulla. Other than that, 3 and 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Okay? So when you want to study the brainstem, remember that in the tegmentum, lemnisci, cranial nerve nuclei. Perfect. What else? I have cerebellar peduncles. Superior cerebellar peduncle, middle cerebellar peduncle, inferior cerebellar peduncle. Perfect. Number 3. If you guys look at your brainstem, this is the cerebellum posteriorly. This is the cerebellum posteriorly, and this is anteriorly. Remember, guys, the general rule? Remember that we said that the sensations are posteriorly, and motor function and motor fibers are anteriorly? Please remember that, because that will help you a lot when you look at a cross-section of the brainstem, and that will help you to be able to identify. If you look at a section in the midbrain or pons or medulla, and you look anterior, and let's be concise to the pons and midbrain, and you guys can see something anteriorly, this is going to be related to the motor innervation, which is the corticospinal tract or corticonuclear or whatever. We're going to talk about that. When we come to the pons, it's going to be related to motor stuff, okay? And then the medulla is quite different because it's continuation of the spinal cord, and we're going to build on the information based on what we've taken in the spinal cord, okay? So remember, the broad idea of the brainstem is that you have a core. The core is called tegmentum. In the tegmentum, you will get to see lemnisci, cranial nerve nuclei. Perfect. And then anteriorly, and this is of course sensory tracts, and anteriorly you have motor stuff, and we're going to talk about that in midbrain and pons. And in the medulla, the general rule is that we are doing a continuation of what we've taken in the spinal cord. Okay, so this is a broad idea. I just want you to just remember it as we proceed, because that will make your life easy. Now, if you look at the medulla, you guys, if you look at the medulla, at the foramen magnum, the spinal cord is going to give you the medulla. Now, if you look at the medulla, remember what did we take in the spinal cord? Remember what was there? I wish I had a picture for the spinal cord here, but anyway, we can just quickly draw it. All right, so guys, remember the spinal cord? We said that posteriorly we had the sensations. We had the fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cuneatus, all right? And then we said that anteriorly we had the motor stuff. So if I want to look at the medulla, and I can see that this is the ventral part, this is anteriorly, okay? So this is the ventral here, this is the ventral, because cerebellum is posterior, right? So if we have cerebellum, it means this is the posterior. If I don't have cerebellum, this is anterior. Now what's gonna happen? Again, anterior means motor. Yes. So what was the motor tracts? It was the corticospinal. Yeah, but we don't call them corticospinal unless they exceed the pyramids. So if they are coming down from the brainstem down here, the corticospinal tracts are, because they are formed of the pyramidal tracts, We call them pyramids, okay? We call them pyramidal tracts. They're gonna form the pyramids. And these two pyramids, or the corticospinal tracts, here we call them pyramidal tracts, they're gonna decussate, so they're gonna give you the decussation of pyramids at the lower level of the medulla. So what you expect to see at the medulla anteriorly is the pyramids. Okay, perfect. Lateral to that, you have the olives. And inside here, you have the inferior olivary nucleus. Okay, so we have the pyramids, we have the olives, and then posteriorly, you have your inferior cerebellar peduncles. Okay, so this is the order. You have the pyramids, you have the olives, and then you have the inferior cerebellar peduncles, because that will help you to connect to the cerebellum. Okay, so we have we have three things anteriorly. What about posteriorly? Remember, it was the sensory tracts, you guys. It was the gracilis, the fasciculus, gracilis, and cuneatus. So if you look posteriorly, you will find the fasciculus gracilis, and then the fasciculus cuneatus, and then the lateral one is gonna be the trigeminal, the last one. So here you're gonna have the tubercles, because the nucleus is down here. So you have the gracilis nucleus. Okay, so here you have the cuneate nucleus. Nucleus is the group of cell bodies, and we're going to talk about that in the internal structure, so don't worry about that. And then here you're going to have the trigeminal tubercle. So again, in the medulla, we have anterior, pyramids, olives, inferior cerebellar peduncles. Posteriorly, sensory, continuation of spinal cord, the gracilis, we have them, the fasciculi, and then here the nuclei. The tubercle is made by the collection of the cell bodies, the nucleus inside, the gracilis, and then cuneatus, and then the trigeminal tubercle. Okay, and we're going to talk about the trigeminal as we proceed. And this is the closed medulla. It's more or less looks like the spinal cord, because it's basically continuation of the spinal cord. Okay. Now, if we go up here, we have the open part of the medulla. And the open part of the medulla is open because it makes the floor of the fourth ventricle, and it's closed by the cerebellum. So the rhomboid fossa, here we have a rhomboid fossa because it's rhomboid in shape. It's the lower part is made by the medulla, and the upper part is made by the pons. And we're going to talk about the pons later on. Now, what do we have in the medulla here? We have the hypoglossal trigon. It's made by the hypoglossal nucleus. We have the vagal trigon made by the dorsal vagal nucleus, and we have the vestibular area. Okay, so we're going to talk about that in the internal structure into more details. And also here we have the stria medullaris, which is basically transversely running fibers that will help me to demarcate the end of the medulla and the start of the pons. So anteriorly, we have pyramids, olives, and the inferior cerebellar peduncles, and motor stuff. Posteriorly, sensory, the dorsal columns are here, the fasciculi, and on the top we have the tubercles. The gracilis is medial, the gracilis for lower limbs, grace for legs, remember, and then the cuneatus, and then the last one is the trigeminal tubercle, and we're going to talk about it. In the open part, we have the hypoglossal, we have the vagal, and then the vestibular area. All right, so that's all about the gross features. Now, this is a nice summary for you guys. Okay, so if you guys look at the closed medulla again here, and this is the open medulla, this is a nice summary for you. You need to build up the information on the spinal cord. This is the floor of the fourth ventricle. How will you know anterior from posterior? Remember, if you see the pons, if you see the trigeminal nerves on top of pons, if you cannot see the cerebellum, this is anteriorly. If you're anterior, remember your motor stuff, remember your pyramids. Okay, if you are posterior, remember your sensory stuff, remember the dorsal columns, and we're coming here to the gracilis and cuneatus. Okay, in the open part, you will remember your hypoglossal and vagal, hypoglossal, tubercles and the vagal made by the hypoglossal nucleus and dorsal vagal nucleus, and you have the vestibular area. All of this lateral part is vestibular area, and we will explain that later on. All right, and so here we have those things, and then the vestibular area, and then we talked about the